Hi, welcome to Owl Play, where we explain and break down all the rules for your favorite board games. I'm Alan, and today I'll be going over the rules for the popular game, Azul, designed by Michael Kiesling and published by Plan B Games. In Azul, each player is a tile-laying artist hired by the King of Portugal with the goal of creating the most beautiful wall for his palace. Players will be grabbing tiles from little factories and laying them into a pattern on their own player boards to score the most points by the end of the game. So without further ado, let me explain how to set up the game. I'll then review all the game rules, including bonus scoring at the end of the game, and also talk about some variations you can try. Here we go. To set up, hand each player their own player boards with the colored side face up and this black scoring marker cube placed on the zero space of the scoring track. Note that players can choose to play the other gray side of the board, but I'll talk more about that later in this video. For now, all players should use the colored side for their first game. Next, you'll want to place the factory displays in a circle around the center of the table and put the first player token in the center of the circle. Now notice that I've placed all 9 factory displays on the table to set up for a 4-player game. However, in a 3-player game, you would only use 7 factory displays. And in a 2-player game, only 5 factory displays are used. The game comes with 20 tiles of each of these 5 different colors for a total of 100 tiles, and they are all placed into the supply bag. The first player, which the game states is the person who most recently visited Portugal, although you can probably use whatever suits your gaming group, draws 4 tiles randomly from the bag and places each set onto a factory display and repeats this until all factory displays are full. Now, for the purposes of this video, I'll just fast forward and place all the tiles onto the factory display so you can see what the table kind of looks like once the setup is complete. And that's how the center of the table should look like in a 4-person game, and concludes the setup for Azul. As you can see, this game has a beautiful table presence, and games typically take about 30 minutes to complete. Next, let me explain how gameplay works. The game is played over multiple rounds, and each round takes place over 3 phases. They are 1, the factory offer, 2, wall tiling, and 3, preparing for the next round. So, let's start with the first phase, and I'll explain how that works. In the factory offer phase, all players, starting with the first player, take turns in clockwise order, drafting tiles from these factory displays and placing those tiles on their player boards. On a player's turn, they must draft all tiles of the same color from any one of the factory displays and then move any untaken tiles to the center of the table next to the first player marker. So, for example, if it was my turn, I could take these 2 black tiles and place them on my board, and I would have to move the yellow and green tiles to the center of the table. Or, if I was choosing the same factory display, I could take the yellow tile and move the remaining 3, the 2 black ones and the green one, to the center of the table. I could also take these 3 red tiles and move the yellow one to the center, or I could even take all 4 of these blue tiles, and there would be no tiles to move to the center of the table. Once the first player has taken their tiles and placed them on their player board, the next player in clockwise order would then draft their tiles, and the next player would draft theirs, and so on, and this continues until all tiles have been cleared from all factory displays, and the next phase, wall tiling, can begin. So, as you can see, if I take these, the next player might take the red ones and move that to the center. The next player might take these 2 blue ones and move these to the center. And you can see how the center is starting to fill out. Now it's important to know that once tiles are moved to the center of the table, that area is now also considered a factory display, and players can choose to take all tiles of the same color from that area instead of the standard factory displays. And the first player to take tiles from the center of the table will also take the first player marker, which means that they will be the starting player on the next round. That player must place the first player marker on their player board. So let's take a look at that board to explain where that marker goes and how players place any drafted tiles that they choose. First, let me quickly mention that the player who takes the first player marker would place it on the leftmost available space of the floor line on their player board right here. This means that the player would get minus points during the wall tiling phase, but I'll explain that a little later in this video. Now, to explain how chosen tiles are placed on the player board, it's important to understand that tiles are first placed on the left side of the player board, consisting of pattern lines. Once we get to the wall tiling phase, I will explain how those tiles are moved from the pattern lines to the right side of the player board, which is considered to be each player's wall. Now, when a player has chosen the tiles from a factory display, they must place their tiles one by one from right to left in any of the pattern lines, with the following exceptions. If the pattern line already has tiles of a certain color, the player may only add tiles of the same color to that row. So, for example, on this fourth line, as you can see, I have 2 blue tiles. If I picked up another 2 blue tiles from one of the factory displays, I could place these 2 blue tiles next to the first 2 to complete my line. However, if instead I had picked up these 2 yellow tiles, I could not place them on the line because they are of a different color. I would have to place these 2 tiles on some other line, so I could place them down here on the last line, or I could place them there on the third line, for example. Once all spaces of a pattern line are filled, that line is considered to be complete. Any excess tiles that are placed on that line are instead placed on the leftmost space of the floor line, as they are essentially dropping to the floor. So, for example, if I had picked up these 3 blue tiles from a factory display, I could place 2 of them on the fourth line, but since there's no room for the third tile that I picked up, this tile will essentially drop to the floor. Alternatively, I could place one of those blue tiles on the first line, and since the other 2 tiles don't fit, both of these would drop to the floor. Now it's important to note that I could not place any excess tiles on another line. They must be placed on the floor line even if you have a spot for them on another line. So, for example, I could not place this blue tile on the first line and have these 2 blue tiles fill up the fourth line. I must drop these to the floor since I cannot fill them up on the first line. Finally, in later rounds, as the wall on the right side of the player board is filled, players are not allowed to place tiles of a certain color in a pattern line whose corresponding line on their wall already holds a tile of that color. For example, if I had picked up these 2 blue tiles from a factory display, I would ideally like to place these 2 tiles on the second or third pattern line. Unfortunately, the corresponding lines on my wall, this second and third line, already have the blue tiles filled out, and therefore I cannot place these 2 tiles on the second or third pattern line. And since I could not fit these tiles on any other pattern line, I would be forced to place these 2 tiles on my floor line. As I explained earlier, the floor line is where players will place any tiles that are in excess of a complete pattern line, or any tiles that cannot be placed altogether, as in the example of my 2 blue tiles, as well as the first player marker. and tiles are always placed from left to right. These tiles will result in minus points during the wall tiling phase, so let's explain that phase, which is carried out by all players simultaneously. Although, for your first game, I would suggest that all players take a turn so that everyone can understand how it works. In this phase, players will move only complete pattern lines over to their wall. Players do this by going through from top to bottom, each complete pattern line moving the rightmost tile to the space of the same color in the corresponding line of the wall, and then scoring points immediately for that placement. So, for example, my first line is complete with this red tile, and since it's the only tile there and the rightmost tile, I would then move this tile over to its corresponding space on the wall, and then scoring for that tile immediately. On the second line, I would then take the rightmost yellow tile and move it over to its space, and then scoring for that tile immediately. And finally, on the third line, which is also complete, I would take the rightmost blue tile and move it to its corresponding space on the same line, and scoring for that tile immediately at that point as well. Now we'll explain scoring shortly, but once the action is performed for each line, the player removes all other tiles from the pattern lines that have a missing rightmost tile and places them in the game box, which will eventually be used to refill the supplied bag. So, in this case, my first line is complete, but there is no other tiles over here. The second and third lines have missing rightmost tiles, and therefore I would take these 3 tiles and return them to the game box. Now it's important to note that all tiles of any incomplete pattern line will remain there for the next round, and players can work towards completing that pattern line in future rounds. So in this case, the 4th and 5th line, these green and black tiles would remain there for future rounds, and I can work towards filling the remaining spaces. Next, let's explain how scoring works. Once a tile is moved to a player's wall, it is immediately scored on the score track as follows. If there are no tiles directly adjacent orthogonally, that is, horizontally or vertically, to the newly placed tile, the player gains 1 point on the score track for that tile. So, in this example, our first line is complete. We'd move the red tile over to its corresponding space. And since there are no tiles directly adjacent, both horizontally or vertically, to this tile, the player would then just score 1 point for this particular tile, and you would move the marker 1 point on the score track. Otherwise, if there are any tiles orthogonally adjacent to the newly placed tile, players must first check if there are 1 or more tiles horizontally linked to the newly placed tile and score all tiles 1 point, including the newly placed one. So that was a lot of wording, but essentially on the second line, if I'm placing this blue tile into its corresponding space, I would check to see if there are any tiles directly adjacent orthogonally. In this case, the green tile is next to the blue one. Since it is the only tile that is horizontally linked to this tile, I would score 1 point for each of these tiles, and therefore would score 2 points. Players must then check for 1 or more vertically linked tiles to the newly placed one and score all tiles 1 point, including the newly placed one. So in our latest example, suppose I had this green tile on the third line of my wall. If I was to place this blue tile, I would again check to see if there are any linked tiles orthogonally. In this case, there are these two green tiles. I would then score 1 point for each of these tiles because they are linked horizontally, and would score another 2 points for these 2 tiles because they are linked vertically. It's important to note that in our example, the newly placed blue tile was scored twice. Once for the horizontally linked set of tiles and once for the vertically linked set of tiles as well. Let's take a more complex example. In this case, on the third line, I've completed this set of blue tiles. I would then take the rightmost blue tile and drop it right in its spot on the wall. Now again, I'm going to check to see if there are any other tiles that are linked orthogonally to this blue tile. In this case, there's a whole series of them. Horizontally, all 4 of these tiles are linked to this blue one. And vertically, all of these tiles are linked to this blue tile. Therefore, I would score 4 points for this horizontal line and 4 points for this vertical line for a total of 8 points. Keep in mind that this blue tile over here is not connected orthogonally to this blue tile since it's on a diagonal, and we don't count those in our scoring. In this final example, we have a similar situation in which I've completed this third pattern line with these blue tiles. I would move this blue tile over to its space. Again, orthogonally, there are other tiles that are linked to this blue tile, including this black and red tile, as well as these other 3 tiles vertically. Therefore, I would score 3 points for this horizontal line and 4 points for this vertical line. Now, even though we have these linked, this black tile is not counted because it technically is not linked to these 3 tiles because of this spot that is missing the green tile. Finally, at the end of the wall tiling phase, check for any tiles in the floor line and lose the number of points indicated directly above each placed tile. Those tiles are then also removed and placed in the game box, except for the first player marker, which is returned to the center of the table. So in this example, this player would lose 1, 2, plus another 2, which is 4, plus another 2, which is a total of 6 points. They would then take these 3 tiles and return them to the game box, and take the first player marker and place it in the center of the table. Next, let's take a look at the final phase of the round, where we prepare to begin the next round. The player who took the first player marker in the current round refills each factory display with 4 tiles, just as was performed in the initial setup of the game. Now, if the bag is ever empty while refilling, that player refills the bag with all tiles placed in the game box during previous rounds and continues to fill all remaining factory displays. Now, the game states that in the rare case that you would ever run out of tiles completely from the bag or from the game box, simply fill up as many factory displays as possible and proceed with the subsequent round. And that's how you play Azul. Now, you might be wondering, how does the game end? Well, in any round where a player completes at least 1 horizontal line with 5 consecutive tiles on their wall during the wall tiling phase, the game ends at the end of that round, and players skip the third phase of that round altogether. And finally, bonus scoring is tabulated for the game. Let me go ahead and explain how bonus scoring works. There are 3 bonus scoring goals that players can achieve, and they are all listed in the bottom right-hand corner of the player boards. First, players gain 2 points for each complete horizontal line of 5 consecutive tiles on their wall. This will typically be scored by the player who ended the game. However, it's possible for other players to trigger the end game in the same round, or that a player has completed more than 1 horizontal line during the final round. Next, players gain 7 points for each complete vertical line of 5 consecutive tiles on their wall. And finally, players gain 10 points for each complete set of placed colors on their wall. So for example, if a player had placed all of their red tiles on their wall, they would get 10 points. And this is cumulative. So if they had put all 5 blue tiles on their wall, that would be another 10 points. The player with the most points on the scoring track of their player boards is considered the winner of the game, and in the case of a tie, the players share the victory. And that's everything you need to know to play Azul. Now for a slightly different and more challenging game, you can use the gray side of the player board. The rules are exactly the same as the color side, except when moving a tile from a complete pattern line to your wall, you can move that tile to any space on the corresponding line, as long as that color does not appear horizontally or vertically from that space. So for example, if you were to place a black tile in the central space of the wall, black tiles could not appear vertically in the central line or horizontally on the central line. Now, the game suggests that when using the gray side, that all players use that side of their board. Otherwise, all players can use the colored side. I hope you enjoyed watching this video, and until next time, have fun playing games.